Going. Okay, we are live. Cool. Good morning, everyone. Lance Tarchioni and Heather Freebairn here with you live from the Monmouth Studios for this week's episode of Ask the Agronomist. So appreciate Heather making it in this morning, live and in person. It's always nice to not be by myself in the room when I'm doing Ask the Agronomist. And lately, I've had some where I didn't have a guest and. We continue to get feedback that Ask the Agronomist is always better with a guest, and so as other people have learned, less of me is better, and so we'll have another guest on here sometime soon. I'm still working on my setup here. So okay, so good morning, everybody. Heather was teasing me. I put in the chat. Hang out with us while the dew dries off. And she kind of challenged me. She said, the air is so dry. I'm not sure there is any dew. And it does get a little damp in the morning, but yeah, it's, I told her it's like I've never lived in New Mexico, but I think this is kind of what their air is like. And so, it's when it's 90 in the afternoon and it's, more comfortable than you would have expected. And when by dark it's already down to 75 and feels quite comfortable, and then in the morning it's 58 and feels really comfortable, that's because there's no humidity trapping the heat in our air. And so I'm ready for fall to come back. That taste of fall we got a couple weeks ago, that was awfully nice, and we can go back to that anytime as far as I'm concerned. But compared to summer sweltering heat, when we're talking heat indexes because the humidity is approaching 100%, this is not bad. But it is rapidly drying our already too dry crop, and we're going to talk about managing harvest moisture, doing what we can to manage harvest moisture. You can't really fix that problem, but you can do some things that maybe help. Heather and I were talking about our friend of the program and sometimes guest host with me, Kurt Imkin. He and his brother fell victim to a combine fire on their farm yesterday. So it's a tinderbox out there, as you all know. So please be careful. Kurt's fine, family's fine. Nobody was injured, thankfully. But he sent me a picture. It was all aglow with a plume of black smoke. And when you see the plume of black smoke this time of year, you kind of figure somebody's combine is on fire. And sometimes the whole field that the combine is in is on fire as well. That was thankfully not the case for Kurt. And his brother, I think they were in a bean field, so it's a little bit harder to catch a bean field on fire than it is a cornfield. But be safe out there and be careful. It's a lot of times it's amazing, especially this newer equipment. When you're hauling 300 or 400 gallon of diesel fuel and rubber tires and a machine that is half plastic. It's amazing how little is left after a good hot combine fire. I mean, there's like an axle and a small piece of frame, and a lot of stuff that's even metal is thin enough metal that when it gets that hot, it melts too. So yeah, there's almost nothing left to haul away these days if you get a combine fire on a newer combine. So anyway, several things on the list. I want to talk about yields. We're as we get deeper and deeper into harvest and record pace of harvest. I don't know. It's hard to compare over time. Harvest pace, but this is going to be an early harvest for sure. We started early. We've had basically no rain delays. I don't think my 10-day forecast has anything in it right now. Heather's shaking her head no as well. So, breakdowns, which I have all the time. We were trying to cut beans yesterday and finally got rolling. I had about 50 acres done and developed a bad enough issue with our bean platform that it came off, went to the dealership, and we switched to corn. So I'm going nowhere fast in harvest, and you real farmers are getting a lot more done than Kurt and I. I get slightly more done than Kurt with no combine, with a combine, and so Kurt and I are both riding the struggle bus here this harvest. But we'll get through it, and hopefully your corn is still standing relatively well. I do want to talk about stalk quality as it relates to root quality in corn. You've probably heard me mention a gentleman by the name of Randy McElroy. Randy was kind of a mentor of mine. He retired a year or so ago from Bayer, and Randy always said, and this is one of those things, one of those agronomy truths, that all stalk rots start as a root rot, and I actually think that is very, very true. Your root system loses its health. That crown rot is working against your roots. And as your roots start to die and decay and get weaker and function less, that puts immense pressure on that plant to try to finish the ear with a root system that's not functioning very well. And that leads to cannibalization, which leads to stalk quality issues. And as that plant cannibalizes itself, cannibalization is just the usage of stored sugar in the plant. Maintaining some sugar in the tissue is what makes a plant resistant to decay. So if you've ever seen a plant that had no ear on it, like a deer ripped it off, or it was just a plant that didn't have an ear for whatever reason, and you've noticed at harvest time, it's still green and it's still healthy and it looks gorgeous, and you're thinking, gosh, I wish my plants that had ears looked as nice as the plants that don't have ears. Well, the reason they look so nice is they don't have an ear. So there's a relationship between those two things. And they were not working themselves to death trying to finish the ear that they didn't have. And that's why they're so healthy. So we're working from a breeding standpoint, trying to develop hybrids that have the ability to fend off those diseases and maintain enough sugar in the plant so that it doesn't turn into a buffet for all the different fungal pathogens that are out there. But once a plant is depleted of its sugar, it's not really resistant to anything anymore at that point. And so I've been, this time of year, I tend to find myself in fields that are having standability challenges. And we had a wind event come through about a month ago ish, kind of on the 116 corridor. So from like Stronghurst, Roseville, all the way to, Fairview area. There's a swath through there where there were some 60 and 70 mile an hour winds about a month ago. And the stuff that, was already being impacted by corn was green at that time. But it was not as healthy as it looked. And it had some crown rot working on the roots. So we had some roots that were weak. And if we had weak roots in that wind, we ended up getting quite a bit of root lodging, some stalk lodging as well, but probably even more root lodging than we did stalk lodging in most of these fields of down corn. And when you dig those plants up today, the root system is just virtually completely decayed. And we're getting into those really challenging situations where you're trying to get through down corn. And as soon as the slide underneath the stalk to try to pick up the down corn, the root ball pops out of the ground. And then you get the whole plant and the root ball and all the dirt and all the mess and all the aggravation, all the frustration coming at you there in the combine. So if you're, even the corn that's standing, stalk quality is not fantastic. Root quality is probably not fantastic. We've got such dry soil. Dry things do not lodge as easily in a dry soil as they do in a wet soil. But, should we happen to get rain again sometime and we soften that soil up and get any wind along with that rain, then we're going to be wishing we hadn't got the rain, because there's going to be some lodging that occurs from that. So, if you're frustrated with how quickly your crop died, and you're frustrated with how quickly it got dry, let's say you had good intentions of harvesting some 20% plus corn, and by the time you got started, it was 19, and now it's 16, on its way to 13. The crop is drying extremely fast, and this crop kind of limped across the finish line because of the disease pressure we were dealing with. In some cases, we've had yields that were better than I expected. Now, I would say as we've gone deeper into harvest, we've gotten into fuller season hybrids. We've gotten into later planting dates. We've gotten into more challenged fields. It seems to me a little bit like the best corn has been harvested, and it's going to kind of be downhill from here, which is a little bit of a little bit normal because we get our highest yields typically harvesting 22, 23, 24, 25% corn. And even if there's nothing wrong with your crop, it's not going to yield as good at 16 as it did at 23. Dr. Belo did some really good research. You can go to their crop physiology website, and I think they've got last year's result or 2 years ago's results are published. I don't know if last year's results have been published yet or not. He did a really good phantom yield loss study, and phantom yield loss is a pretty popular topic. People like to talk about it. There's been some university work done in the past, some work in Nebraska, some work at Purdue, indicating that there was a possibility that maybe while that crop's drying in the field, you're losing more than water weight. Maybe you're losing some dry matter weight from that kernel as well. And so the idea of this phantom yield loss kind of became a thing. And Dr. Belo's work from a couple of years ago showed that there absolutely is yield loss as corn dries, but there's no phantom. It's all just physical, mechanical yield loss. And he looked at a lot of different hybrids. He looked at hybrids with good grain quality. He looked at hybrids with poorer grain quality. They harvested corn at 35%, 30, 25, 20, and 15. And when they harvested it by hand, which is how they did it, and if you're gonna do a phantom yield loss study, you got to harvest by hand. You can't harvest with a combine and do a phantom yield loss study, because you're always going to have more physical yield loss harvesting dry corn. I don't care how good your combine is. I don't care how good you set it. You're going to have more head shelling. You're going to have more dropped ears. You're going to have more lodged stalks. You're going to leave more of your grain in the field. And when they harvested at different moisture levels by hand and got every kernel that the plant produced, lo and behold, they all yielded the same after you adjusted for moisture. So the yield of 15% corn was just as good as the yield of 30% corn when you harvested it by hand. The reality is we don't harvest much by hand these days, and I don't think you want to start. So that's why it's a reality that harvesting corn at 15%, it's going to yield less because we have more mechanical loss. So yield loss is real. Dr. Belo's work, which I think is the best phantom yield loss study I've seen, would indicate that there is no phantom involved with yield loss. It's just mechanical. So if you're getting into some crop that is maybe not as awesome as you heard your neighbor's was, which, sometimes your neighbor lies, that, right? He says the same thing about you. So sometimes you got to wonder if, all the yield stories you hear are true. I do know of situations where, FSA says the field is 83 acres, but grandpa called it 79. So we figure the yield on 79. That's, some people would call that, well, that's just being respectful to my grandfather's memory. Other people would call that cheating. So sometimes you don't know what to believe out there. But if on your own farm, if you've been in some 280 corn, and you've been in some 240 corn, and you've been in some 225 corn, that's kind of the range. I'd say 200 to 280, for field average yields is kind of the range. And there's places where, there's quite a bit of 260 plus corn. And then you get into other places where, the weather was different, the disease pressure was different, something in the environment was different. And all of a sudden the good stuff's making 240 and it's downhill from there. So sometimes if you're the guy that's in that tough spot and you're picking 240 corn and you've heard about somebody else's 280 corn, is the 280 real? Or if it is real, what's different? It might be the same hybrid. You might have done the same farming practices. It just, yields vary. You guys know that. That's not That's not anything new, but it's hard when you're harvesting your mediocre crop and you hear about somebody else's, well, that sounds really good crop. When harvest first started, I was shocked at how good things were. As we've gone deeper into harvest, I keep finding more and more and more instances of yields that are closer to what I expected. I didn't expect to have 280 field averages, and there haven't been very many. Some of the guys that started with that, they had one and they were really, really excited, and they haven't had one since. And they keep trying to find another 280 field, and it's just not out there. So if that's been your experience, you're not alone. If that hasn't been your experience and every field you harvested is 280 plus, I would suggest you just smile yourself and keep that to yourself and enjoy the fruits of your labor, because most of us are not going to have that experience. Kind of seeing the same thing in soybeans, frankly, maybe even a little more dramatic in soybeans than it is in corn. A lot of the early planted early beans we were clicking off a lot of 80s. You're hearing a lot of talk of 80 this and 80 that, and lately I don't hear as much of that. We took a plot out yesterday here near Monmouth. Really good ground, good farmer, good production practices. Now it was planted May 15th, which that's a little bit late for bean planting in this day and age. But I think like 76 was the best of 30 some entries, down into the mid 60s from there. The field of beans I'm working on at home is on some, Class B soil, nothing special ground, got timber around it, got some deer damage, and that field's maybe not going to make 65. So not all the beans are making 80. So if you've heard about somebody's 82 bushel soybeans and you're picking your 69 or 70 or 71 bushel soybeans and wondering, well, what the hell? They're not all 80, and again, this crop to me is kind of settling into more like what I expected. It's good, it's not great. And there are pockets where, the same bean I've got that's making 65, I know a guy over by Bloomington that, had it in a field that was doing close to 90. There have been 90 bushel bean fields that are legit. There's also been 60 bushel bean fields that are legit. So the soybean yield range is, I'm going to say 60 to 90. The corn yield range is 200 to 280, and those are kind of comparable ranges for the two crops. When corn always, the variability in corn yield is always more than the variability in bean yield, because corn yields 3 times as much as soybeans, so the variability is going to be 3 times as much as well. But one thing I did want to talk about relative to soybeans was harvest moisture, and obviously when we have this kind of weather, the crop standing in the field is almost like being in a dryer. I mean, the air is extremely dry, and it's warm, and it's sunny, and it's breezy, and you could probably come very close to cutting beans around the clock these days. And the way the bean crop's coming out, I think some of you might be cutting around the clock. I mean, you can just watch the crop disappearing overnight, it seems like. And on a still night, there's just a fog or a haze of bean dust everywhere where guys are harvesting soybeans. But I did a little math here this morning, and this is kind of an extreme example because soybeans don't often get down to 8%, but some of you have harvested some 8% beans. I don't know that I've ever had anything that was 8.0, but I've had some stuff that was 8 point something. So I did the math this morning that a 75 bushel bean crop at 8% would have been almost 82 at 13. And that's just the water weight loss. That doesn't count the increased shatter loss that you have. So if you're disappointed in your beans when they're 8%, they could have been, when you combine water weight loss and additional harvest loss, they could have been 10 bushel better at 13. And typically speaking, if you added 8 to 10 bushel to that yield you're disappointed in, you'd be pretty happy with it. And so it's really hard to harvest beans at 13% these days. You got to be cutting a lot of lima beans and butter beans and tough beans. We've talked on here before about the idea of desiccating soybeans, and there are some of you out there that have had firsthand experience with that. I have not. We've got some researchers that have done some trials with it. My former colleague Chris Carlisle, he worked with some growers that were doing it. There are certain things in crop production that require a level of management that a lot of us, frankly, don't have the capability to manage. And I put myself in this category. You got to be really, really, really on the ball with your management if you're going to desiccate soybeans, because the timing is super critical, and it's also critical, how you do it, how much you do at one time. If you spray too early, you're going to hurt your yield. If you spray too late, you don't really speed them up any. If you spray too much, you got too many acres to harvest, and you end up back in the same spot. But the idea of desiccating soybeans is you dry the plant out as fast as the grain is dry. And so you end up with a dry plant with 13, 14% grain, versus the way it works in nature, especially in years like this, when we have fall droughts and we have low humidity conditions and we have hot temperatures, the pod and the grain can dry so much faster than the plant. It's not really a genetic problem. It's a physics problem. It's not that breeders need to breed soybeans differently. The grain just dries faster than the stem and the rest of the plant does. And so it's really, really, really difficult to harvest beans the first time they get to 13% in these conditions. And even if you got a combine with enough horsepower and you're willing to spend enough money on diesel fuel to chug through them, they're only there for about 2 days, and you can't get all your beans cut in 2 days. Now, one thing that you can do to try to help this situation, and I really recommend this, you plant a wider range of maturity of soybeans. You plant your early beans first, you plant your late beans last, and you try to progress your harvest through the maturities. So you have to, ideally, I want to put the right bean in the right field. And when you start thinking about, well, okay, I need to harvest this, I want to harvest this farm early, so I need an early bean here. Well, that means you plant an early bean there, even if the early bean's maybe not the best bean for that field. And so it gets really complicated when you try to think about, okay, this is the way I'm going to plant, this is the way I'm going to harvest. I'm going to plant the same route that I'm going to harvest. And so the field that I plant first, I'm going to harvest first. The field that I plant last, I'm going to cut last. The field that I plant first is going to be my earliest bean, so it's ready to cut first. And then I'm going to plant, maybe 25% of my acres in that maturity. And then I'm going to switch to a fuller season bean that's maybe 3 or 4 days later, and plant another 15 or 20 or 25%. Then I'm going to switch to a bean. So to do that, you need to be planting probably a 1 maturity group spread. So if you want to start with a 2-6, you should go at least to a 3-6. If the earliest bean you want to plant is a 3-0, then you probably ought to go up to at least a 4-0. Well, then we start running into arguments like, well, yeah, but my early beans have been better, so I want to plant more early beans. Well, fine, but that means you're going to have half your bean crop ready to cut at the same time. And then you're going to be probably losing more yield in harvest timeliness than you might have gained genetically by planting the bean that you thought was better. So it's an imperfect science, because you can design the best plan in the world, and then you have equipment breakdowns, you have rain delays, you have problems that happen, and that kind of blows up your plan. But if you think you want to try to plan it out that way, plant your earliest bean first, plant your fullest season bean last, and your earliest bean should be about 1 maturity group earlier than your latest bean. And then, if you plant all your beans in a 10-day window, that will work. If you plant all your beans in a 45-day window, that's not going to work particularly well. So, there's things you can try to do. Sometimes best plan. What's that saying about best laid plans that doesn't work out that way. But if you want to try that, same thing with corn. You plant your early corn first, take your early corn out. With corn, if you don't want to harvest 13% corn, we need to be ready to start at 23 or 24 or 25% moisture on some 105-day corn, and then work your way up to 120-day corn as you go through harvest. And you can kind of do the same thing with corn, but it gets very difficult to do. And years like this, even if you did it perfectly, you still can't get it out before it gets too dry. And that's just a reality. But, you got to be willing to start when things are a little too wet and a little too tough. Because if you wait till it's easy, good going, it's going to be too dry long before you get done. And some of us, I'm in this category. If you haul grain to an auger or to a grain setup in a gravity wagon, you don't want to be getting 25% corn out of a gravity wagon. Maybe if you've got newer wagons than I do that are a little better designed, and maybe you got them all slip plate painted, maybe 25% corn will come out of your wagons. But when the 25% corn quits running out of my wagons, there's a third of the corn still in the wagon. And then the fat old guys getting up there and climbing in and pushing it down out the door. You don't want to do that. So, stuff comes out really good when it gets down to about 17 or 18. Well, that's not a good time to start your corn harvest. But, for some of us, that's kind of how our equipment works the best. And it's just a real challenge this year. Same with the last year with this dry air, no rain, all the heat, stuff's just, guys you're on beans now. You're grumbling about your 8, 9, 10% beans, wishing they had a little more moisture left in them. You haven't done corn for a while. You get back on corn, all of a sudden it's 14 when it was 18 the last time you were in it. You're wondering, well, what the hell do I do here to not be corn's not quite as awful as soybeans when it comes to yield loss, but a 250 bushel corn crop at 13% would have yielded 256 at 15%. And that's not counting any harvest loss. That's just the water that you don't get to sell because you're drier than the moisture. We talk about comparing yields and such, and that's one thing I like to remind people is when you sit down at the end of the year, you start going through your field view reports, and you're looking at the average yield of different hybrids or the average yield of different fields. Pay attention to the harvest moisture on those, because it's really not fair to compare the yield of a field that was harvested at 24% to the yield of a field that was harvested at 14%. If the field that got harvested at 14% was anywhere near the yield of the field that got harvested at 24, I'm going to say the hybrid that was harvested at 14 won, because it probably should have been at least 20 bushel less, just due to extra harvest loss. And if it got within 5, that's pretty remarkable when you're comparing that wide of a spread of moisture. So, we gotta make sure we're making apples to apples comparisons, which we struggle to do sometimes. The other mistake I see people make is you're comparing the average yield of 300 acres of hybrid A to the average yield of 40 acres of hybrid B. Can't do that either. It's nice with having Heather here with her background in climate. And I know she's smiling inside when I talk about field view, and you can do like a region report, in there and compare 5 acres of this to 5 acres of that. Or you can look at, and end rows, big thing too. So what happens so often is you pull into an 80, you plant the end rows, and then you plant till the hybrid runs out, and you switch to a different hybrid. And so you've got, say, 60 acres of hybrid A that includes all the end rows, and you got 20 acres of hybrid B just right out there in the middle. And hybrid B has a huge advantage over hybrid A in that scenario. And so, when one hybrid's got all the end rows, that's really shafting that hybrid, especially if you farm ground like I farm, and the end rows typically yield somewhere between 0 and 100, and you're averaging that into the yield average of that poor hybrid. It's got no chance of having as good an average yield as the hybrid that was only in the interior of the field. But if you take your field region report in Climate Field View, and you go out there in the middle of the field and you draw a rectangle around that hybrid split, it's going to calculate the yield of 5 acres of hybrid A against 5 acres of hybrid B, right out there in the middle of your field, and outside the end rows, outside the deer, outside the coons. And that's the way to compare the hybrids if you want to try to make hybrid comparisons. So we talked a lot about disease here this morning, and we've obviously talked a lot about diseases this growing season. I asked Heather if she thought this would be an okay conversation, because she's the chemical person in the room here this morning, and I wanted to talk a little bit about expectations around disease control. And I'm going to tell a funny story. So my friend Joe Kinzer was texting. He was in a group chat with Cal, Joe, and I, and those of you that know those three people know that's probably a fun group chat to be in. So Joe was very complimentary of one of our hybrids that he tried 4 bags of, and it was the best corn he harvested this year, the best corn he'd ever had in the particular field that he was in. And he was complimenting the hybrid for how healthy it was. And this is a field that's had a history of crown rot problems. And so Joe doesn't like to plant anything until he's seen it on his farm. And so that was his trial use of this newer hybrid, 114.99 DeKalb. And then that hybrid's having an absolutely phenomenal year this year. I would say that's probably our best hybrid this year. So I got to be careful picking favorites, but it's having a remarkable year. So I'm not surprised when people have good things to say about the year that hybrid is having. But anyway, he was complimenting it on its crown rot tolerance, because it was healthy, it was green, it still had some life left in it, and it yielded tremendously in this field. So he's excited about, okay, you guys got something that's good on crown rot that I know will work in this field. And Chris and I are both like, whoa, hang on a second, Joe. Great hybrid, having a great year. Love the hybrid. Love lots of things about it, but I'm not going to brag about its crown rot resistance. It's not awful, but it's not great either. So I said, if you've got it in a field that has a history of crown rot and it's doing phenomenal, it's not because it's resistant to crown rot. It's because your crown rot pressure is down. And so then he started thinking about it, and he realized that, okay, yeah, I've been doing things different in this field to try to manage crown rot. So I didn't plant it until May 5th. That's the first time I've ever not planted it, earlier in April. And he remembered that they actually had some grass pressure coming in this field late post. And so they wanted to make a herbicide application kind of off schedule. And so he included a fungicide application with that late herbicide application. So this field got a V6-ish fungicide application, which he'd never done in that field before. He used a full rate of a good product at tassel, which he hasn't always done, and he planted it later. And I said, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense then, how that average crown rot hybrid appeared to be immune to crown rot because of your management. You have created an environment that didn't have much crown rot pressure. And so as a seed guy, I should have disagreed with his first statement, because now rather than my hybrid being special. He's taking all the credit for his good management. And so I jokingly said, well, now wait a minute, Joe, what happened to the great hybrid? He's like, well, Lance, he says, you know how this works. He said, if anything good happens, it's because of my management. And if anything bad happens, it's because your hybrid sucks. And he used to sell seeds, so he knows how that goes. But anyway, that got me thinking. That and other conversations I've had. You buy a fungicide for what reason? To protect your corn from disease, right? Or maybe chasing a little, plant health yield increase, or maybe stock quality. You buy the fungicide, you make the investment, and as you know, it is a significant investment to help protect your crop, improve the standability, maybe make it yield more, hopefully make it yield more. And then when it still dies and the stock quality is still not great and the yield is maybe less than you hoped it would be, your nature is that you want to know why that product didn't handle the disease better than it did. And I guess I'm going to ask the question, why do you first not ask, why didn't my fungicide work better? And that's why I wanted Heather's permission to have this conversation, because, we're in the business of selling fungicide, as are other companies. We're also selling the seed in many cases. And so, in some cases, I've got 2 products on the acre that you could blame for your problem. And I get it that there are differences in hybrids. But even when you see a difference in hybrid, if you're seeing a dramatic difference in hybrids based on their disease resistance, that's a little bit of an indication that the fungicide didn't do a good enough job to protect the germplasm from disease. And if you're having those feelings this year, you got several different levers you can pull there going into next year. Next year's going to be different. Next year's probably not going to be, a historic southern rust year. We have a bad southern rust year about every 5 years. So hopefully we got another 3 or 4 years before we have another bad southern rust year, but we don't know. I do think I'm seeing a trend in performance in corn this year where things that even if it's a lesser hybrid, with better southern rust resistance, it's having a pretty good year. So almost every hybrid that I see that is just consistently doing well from one plot to the next, all have good southern rust resistance. And that means they're helping the fungicide a lot. They're actually doing most of the heavy lifting. Because if you've got a high level of resistance in your hybrid, then the fungicide doesn't have to perform as well. But if you've got a lower level of resistance in your hybrid, then your fungicide needs to perform well. And if your fungicide didn't perform well enough to protect the hybrid, do you use a different product? Do you use a higher rate? Do you use a different application timing? Do you use a different application method? Do you add an additional application? Or do you switch hybrids? Or do you do some of all of the above? And, if you sprayed fungicide 3 times, and your crop's still dead, falling apart, and not yielding particularly well, then it's probably fair to ask some tough questions about, well, is this really the hybrid that I ought to have in this environment? Now, next year's environment is going to be different. So I'll pick on another one of my hybrids that's not having a particularly good year. So 11727 is a very high yielding VT4 Pro that I really, really like, that hybrid. It's having a tough year. It's pretty susceptible to rust, pretty susceptible to tar spot, and it's not particularly good on crown rot. So it's kind of got the trifecta going for it of things that make corn tough this year. And you, for that hybrid to be performing well, which in places it has, you have to have lower disease pressure. You have to have a better fungicide program, or just have an environment where things were a little gentler on that product for it to be performing, at its best. And when it's at its best, it's phenomenal. But if it dies at half milk because of disease issues, it's a hybrid. I took a plot out; it was very interesting. My demo plot here at the research farm was planted mid-May, so I don't get a tremendous amount of crown rot in that plot because it gets planted too late. Now my crown rot trial just down the lane on the same soil, planted April 15th, was destroyed by crown rot. So it was a good illustration of how planting date can be used to manage crown rot. But this May 15th planted corn, it was primarily foliar disease that took it out. And we saw some dramatic yield differences in this plot, about 70 bushel, due mostly to foliar disease resistance. So everything that died early was off the pace, and the stuff that didn't die early was towards the top. And a lot of those hybrids that were towards the top, genetically, I would say, do not have the yield potential of the hybrids that they beat by 30 or 40 bushel. But it was all about plant health. It wasn't about genetic yield potential. It wasn't about how much can you yield. It was about how long did you live. And if you're in a scenario where living longer is what's enabling you to yield, then you're going to see a pretty good correlation between plant health and yield. If you're in a situation where you had less disease pressure, or where your more aggressive fungicide program kind of leveled the playing field, then you're going to see a different yield relationship. And I'm really looking forward to a plot a mile down the road on very similar soils, planted, I think, the same day or maybe the day after my plot, that had a good fungicide program, that's actually still got some green leaves on it, that hasn't been harvested yet. When that plot comes out, and it's got almost all the same hybrids in it, it's a big plot. I'll have the ability to compare the rankings of those hybrids in a very similar environment with a very similar planting date on very similar soil type. And really, the only difference is, one field had a good fungicide program, one field had nada. And it's, I would guess the sprayed corn is going to yield 50 bushels more than the unsprayed corn did on an average. And there could be some hybrids that are 10 bushels better sprayed and some that are 80 bushels better sprayed. So it'll be interesting to make those comparisons. And if you've got sprayed and unsprayed fields on your farm, or you've got, a field where you did a second pass late, I've got 2 fields where I did a diagonal second pass late that I could see it in my climate imagery about 2 weeks ago. It's, everything's dried down to the point now where things are looking a little more uniform again. But if you caught it at the right stage, I mean, it was a green rectangle on NDVI imagery, and I think it will be a green rectangle on my yield map as well when we get those fields harvested. So lots of side by sides this year, lots of check strips, lots of people playing around with lots of things when it comes to fungicide. Question here: thoughts on planting VT4 on first year corn on corn? Okay, so question is VT4. So VT4 is a double stack rootworm trait with it does not have Herculex rootworm in it. So the difference between SmartStax Pro and VT4 Pro is we pull out one rootworm trait, and it is the Herculex rootworm trait. So VT4 Pro has the RNAi technology in it that SmartStax Pro does, but it does not have the Herc rootworm trait that SmartStax Pro does. I am very comfortable with using VT4 Pro corn on corn. I'm also very comfortable using it on bean stubble because it yields like a Tercepta or a Double Pro. So the VT4 hybrids typically have a little more top end yield. We do have some new SmartStax Pro stuff that might change my tune a little bit on that. But when you're comparing a VT4 Pro to a traditional SmartStax hybrid, I would say the VT4 Pro always has more genetic yield potential than SmartStax does. And you still have the rootworm trait protection. Now, if you're following pumpkins, if you're long-term continuous corn, or if you're in Northern Illinois where rootworm pressure is intense, then I think I would probably rather have SmartStax Pro. I would definitely rather have SmartStax Pro than SmartStax, and I think I would rather have VT4 Pro than SmartStax as well. But in Northern Illinois is a different game. Those guys, there's people using SmartStax Pro, which is the strongest trait package on the market today for rootworm protection and insecticide, and still having more rootworm feeding than they would like to see. So Northern Illinois is kind of in a different environment. In my geography, I'm very comfortable with VT4 Pro corn on corn. Whether it's second year corn, fifth year corn, what have you. As you get into areas where rootworm pressure is heavier, that's when I would probably be a little more comfortable with a SmartStax Pro, assuming your SmartStax Pro has as good a yield potential as your VT4 Pro, and some of the new ones do. So VT4 Pro, I think when it first came out, there were a few of us, and I was kind of in this camp. I was a little bit uncomfortable pushing it corn on corn because I know the rootworm protection is better with SmartStax Pro, but we do have the full rate of Poncho 1250 on the VT4 Pro to help it out, and the performance of VT4 Pro has been so good, and the yield potential is so good. I do think that I have gotten more comfortable, utilizing it corn on corn, but I would still lean you towards SmartStax Pro if you've got horrible rootworm pressure. And typically to have horrible rootworm pressure these days, you have to have 5 years or more continuous corn, pumpkins, or be farming north of Route 88 in Illinois. And if you're north of 88 in Illinois, you can have horrible rootworm pressure anywhere, anytime. So that's where you got to be a little more careful. Appreciate the question. So let's see. We talked about stock quality. Let's talk a little bit about soybeans standability. So there's a lot of lodging in soybeans this year. Maybe you noticed earlier in the growing season that soybeans were extremely tall. Extremely tall soybeans someday become an extremely long soybean. It's very difficult for chest-high soybeans to stand perfectly all season long. Good grower, good friend of the program. Every year he sends me a text. I got it just the other day. And he's probably smiling to himself if he's watching this now, because he knows who he is. He likes to tease me and says, "You guys are spending money making the wrong crop shorter," because it's soybeans that need to be shorter, not corn. And John, I do not disagree with you that we probably year in, year out, we're probably losing more yield in soybeans because they're too tall and lodged than we are because corn is too tall. So we are still excited about our Precision short corn. We have not announced our whatever our height challenge soybean will be called, but I am giving the feedback that you asked me to, that we need to breed shorter beans that stand better, because cutting lodged soybeans sometimes one way to do a good job cutting them is no fun for anyone, and typically they do not yield as good when they are that severely lodged. Now, our breeders have something they call the high yield lean, which is a thing. when you've got such a heavy load of pods on a plant with such high yield potential that it's kind of dragging itself down. I'm okay with the high yield lean. The disappointing yield flat is what we do not want. And the best way to control lodging in soybeans is with A, variety selection, and B, population. You absolutely can make every bean stand better by reducing the seeding rate. And if you're still throwing every bean out there at 140,000, and that's just the only setting you know on your planter, we can do better than that. If you've never considered doing variable rate scripting in soybeans, we can do that. Variable rate scripting in soybeans is the exact opposite of variable rate scripting in corn. We are going to plant the beans on your best ground thinner. We are probably not going to increase the seeding rate of beans on any soil. We're going to leave it the same on your worst ground, and we're going to drop it on your best ground. Nobody needs to plant more than 140 if you're planting beans early, even if you've got light ground. I think 140 is the high rate. I don't think we need a higher rate than 140. Now, if you're planting late, that's different. And there could be some really extreme field soil conditions out there where I would go higher than 140. But in most fields, the lowest yielding part of your bean field, 140 is plenty. And in the highest yielding part of your bean field, 100 is plenty, especially on varieties that have a tendency to lodge. So we can get bolder, we can get braver, we can get more serious about reducing seeding rate in soybeans. That will improve standability. From a breeding side, we need to pay more attention to, height, and we're like you guys. We can't, if we get a high yielder, we can't help ourselves. We got to have it. And there is probably a little bit of a tendency for taller beans to yield more. And I'm saying genetically taller beans, not, so how can I make this make sense? So let's say, I'm gonna draw a picture here. So let's say you got variety, A, that is 48 inches tall. And you got variety B that's 30 inches tall. If variety B was winning in our breeding trials, we wouldn't pick variety A, because we don't pick anything we don't pick them based on height. We pick them based on yield, and then we look at agronomic characteristics. If variety A is a disaster standability, it's not going to get picked. But if variety A yields more and has acceptable standability by our definition, that's the one we're going to pick. So if the shorter beans that stood better were consistently yielding the best in our trials, we'd have a bunch of short beans that stand good rather than a bunch of tall beans that don't stand particularly good. So I think there is probably a little bit, at least in breeding trials, a little bit of a bias towards taller beans yielding more, and that's how we've ended up with some of these big tall rascals. But if you've got severe lodging in variety A, and you've got no lodging in variety B, that's probably going to bring their yield closer together. The other thing that I think is probably a factor here too, if I'm being totally honest, we don't plant soybeans as early as you, and we don't manage soybeans as well as you in breeder trials. We breed really good beans. You raise better beans than we do. Our average breeder trial is a 60, 65 bushel yield environment because they're planted in, late May, sometimes early June. And that is a different environment than you planting your beans April 5th. So I think we've all that once they get in your hands, they don't stand as well because you're going to manage them for higher yields. And when you're managing for 90 bushel soybeans, we have to reduce the seeding rate even more than if you're in a 60, 65 bushel yield environment, because everything you do to push that soybean to produce more, if it adds a lot of vegetative growth, which I've talked to some of the high yield bean gurus, and they've played with biological, products or PGRs to produce growth. They've burned them, they've rolled them, they've tried to injure them. And conversation I had with Alex Harrell, he tried a lot of different things, and the most effective thing he found to improve the standability of his high yield soybeans was reducing the seeding rate. So he was all the way down to 70,000 seeding rate. Now he's in a vastly different environment than all you are, and the problem he had when he got down that low is his branches were so heavily loaded with pods. If they got any wind before harvest, he'd have branches snapping off. And so and then when the branch broke off, it wouldn't get in the combine. He'd just slide right over the top of it. And he was losing a lot of yield from his big, heavily podded lower branches if they broke off. So if he thought he was going to have to bump his seeding rate back up just to keep the branches from getting too heavy and breaking off, which is a problem that you and I don't have in our soybeans. But population is the number one driver for standability. I would say population and genetics would be equal. I would say, in importance of managing standability. So if you're frustrated with the standability of your soybeans, first thing we need to look at is what's your seeding rate. Close second, we need to look at, do we need to make some changes in varieties? One of our best performing soybeans this year is 26XF4, and they don't stand the best. They stand better than 27XF3, which is what most people have replaced the 2.7 with, is the 2.6. But it can have some standability challenges as well. Now it wins plots all the time, and typically guys have been very, very, very pleased with the yield. But when they're hard to harvest, that takes a little bit of the bloom off the rose, as the saying goes, about feeling good about your harvest. But when you're talking about standability of soybeans, you got to look at planting date, you got to look at soil type, you got to look at population, you got to look at genetics, you got to look at, did I get a 3-inch rain with a 60-mile-an-hour wind? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's down because Mother Nature put it down. It didn't go down on its own. It went down in a wind event, typically a wind and rain event, and then it partially stood back up. But there were a lot of beans that were standing really well in spite of being tall, until we had some heavy winds and rain in late July and laid some stuff over. So we'll have lots more conversations about standability in soybeans and what we can do to improve that, and we're certainly going to look at that from the genetic side of things. And I don't disagree with you that there are a lot of, not just Asgrow beans, but beans in general. There are a lot of soybeans in the marketplace today that are just taller than a bean needs to be. And if we could just wave a magic wand and take about 12 inches of height out of soybeans. Now, you get other parts of the country. A colleague of mine in Ohio, Brad Miller, Brad's got a lot of heavy clay soils, and soybeans really shorten up on those guys, on those heavy clay soils. And he's got, they have beans that are 12 inches tall and don't yield very well because they shorten up too much. And so you get other parts of the country, and they don't know what we're talking about. They got these short, itty bitty little beans that, the guy's like, man, that thing would have been good if it would have been taller. And then we've got these gigantic, beautiful, monstrous plants that look like they're going to make 120 that end up making 68, and you cut them one way because they lodge so bad. So it's our growing environment, it's our soil, it's our fertility, it's our productivity. These beautiful soils that we're blessed with, you just get a lot of vegetative growth. And if we could train that soybean plant, and some people try to do this with PGRs and other things, we could train that soybean plant to put its energy into growing pods and seeds, not stem and leaves, it would probably yield more. But while it's growing pods and seeds, it's also growing stem and petioles and leaves and getting big, getting tall, getting rank, and eventually lodging. So with that, I see we are at our time. Appreciate the question came in this morning. If you had a quick question you were wanting to ask, shoot it in there quick before we sign off. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. So this time rolled around faster than I was prepared for, because we did the off schedule episode last week on Monday. So we'll be back to our standard 2 week time. So that'll be the 16th of October. So some of you probably be done with harvest by then. You won't have anything better to do than, it's too dry to put on anhydrous, too warm to put on anhydrous, and you're done harvesting. So hang out with us 2 weeks from today on Ask the Agronomist. I appreciate your time, appreciate your questions. Thanks to Heather for making the trip in this morning. And everybody stay safe. This is a dangerous time of year on the farm. Not just for combines, but for the operators and people too. And don't have a bad day where something bad happens to you or somebody you love. So everybody stay safe. Take care.